That might be slightly premature. You'll decide if you want to clap at the end. Sorry, I should have really unlocked this before. Good to see you again if you were here yesterday. And massive shout out to OICCU for the invitation. I'm really glad to be with you. We're going to be looking at quite a tough question. A question that as I am a woman who is a Christian, has often given me pause for thought. And there are things that I wrestle with and continue to do so. And hopefully we'll be exploring some of that today and why I find Christianity compelling as a woman. So I'm just going to get my slides up. Apologies. Okay. So just to say, as Kezia mentioned, there are people around in light blue hoodies, and I think there's a few dark blue hoodies as well. The topics I'm talking about today are quite triggering, okay, to do with abuse and that sort of things that we see in the Bible. We're going to talk about that. So if that does upset you, or you want to step out, please do, or want to discuss something with one of the volunteers, please do that. And we also know that outside of sort of OICCU's work, there is a whole raft of student services that can support you in that. So I just want to make that disclaimer that we're not insensitive to all of that sort of thing. So the question, is Christianity good news for women? Well, when we maybe think about Christianity or think about religion in general, but I'm talking specifically as a Christian, if we go to our next slide, we might think about these things, that Christianity is regressive, that we're marching along, as I mentioned yesterday, this moral progress, we're marching along to a better society, and actually what Christianity is doing, particularly to women, is pulling us back in the opposite direction. Or perhaps Christianity is patriarchal, where we have men doing stuff in leadership in churches, or it's all around men, okay, and the systems and structures that uphold their power, and Christianity is not helping us. Misogynistic, controlling, or even obsolete when it comes to questions about women and gender in general. Perhaps Christianity just needs to not be a conversation partner anymore. And I get why. This is where we are in our culture. I actually went to a school a few months ago, and they were doing a session with a Christian group that had come in, and the session was on the Bible. You know, can we trust the Bible? Is it reliable? Can we take it seriously? Then I think it was 2023, and a young girl put her hand up, and they were 14 years old, and they said, we can't trust the Bible because it was written by old white men. Now, obviously, the geography of the Bible wasn't properly understood in that young person's mind, but I think her point carried a weight that, you know, the Bible and all things to do with Christianity, hey, is problematic for us, so we can't trust it, we can't trust the claims of the Christian faith. And so I think at the root of this question is a question about God's character. Can God be trusted with who I am as a woman? Because if God can't, then I'm off. And rightly so. So we're going to be exploring some of that today. So before we get into that, there are some questions I'd like you to, have a little chat in your groups. I'm not just here to dictate. I would love you to get involved in conversation. I won't be asking you to feedback, but there's plenty of time to do that in the Slido if you have a question you want to send in towards the end. But for now, 2 questions. Are you skeptical about Christianity and its treatment of women? If so, what sorts of things cause you concern? I'm just going to give you a bit of time to discuss that. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together. Do stick a pin in your thought, and we'll get some more time to talk together. So, one of the things we know that the Bible underpins the basis of Christian faith, and sometimes when we read the Bible, we'll see some things as it pertains to women that are quite frankly horrific. There are feminist theologians that might call it texts of terror, okay, when we approach the Bible. What are we to do with this? One helpful thought from the Reverend Dr. Jenny Williams in her book, God Remembered Rachel, she says this. I find it very helpful to begin navigating these things. Does the Old Testament collude with patriarchal abuses? Does it critique them, or does it not really comment? We will need to observe the difference between places where the Old Testament is prescriptive, says how life should be, and where it is only descriptive, says how life is. And it's very true that when you look at the biblical text, you'll see lots of places where women are abused, they're enslaved, they're treated poorly, all these sorts of things. But there's a difference between describing that stuff and actually saying that's how women should be treated. Very important distinction to make there. And so what I find compelling about that mere fact, even though some of this stuff is distressing, particularly, let's say, in the book of Judges, chapter 19, I'm not going to spell out exactly what happens there, but the Bible is not afraid of really highlighting some of the awful things that can happen to women. It's not sanitizing that. It's saying this is the human condition. How can I explain that further? If we go to our next slide. I don't know if any of you have heard about this situation. It rocks me to my core every time I talk about it or think about it. But there was a young girl in Hackney in London who was strip searched by police because they believed she had drugs on her. And strip searches are very invasive searches. Horrible, horrible event. It turns out she didn't have drugs on her, and so there was an uproar in communities about this. Now, I found out about this because I watched the news, I read newspapers, articles, etc. The news outlets, they were reporting what happened to child Q. And it was horrible to read. But they were not endorsing it. Can you see the difference there? We need to be able to hear about these things. We need to be able to know about these things in order to act, to seek after justice. But the fact that they're reporting about it doesn't mean that they're saying, hey, it's okay. And the same is true a lot of the time when we come to the Bible. The Bible is not erasing some of these things. It's saying, this is what we're like. And then I, as a Christian, believe that there is, found in the Christian faith, a solution to the depravity of our hearts sometimes, where we can go to inflict such injustices upon other people. So that's one way to view things. Another moment for you to have a little chat amongst yourselves. Have you heard of similar stories to Child Q? What was your reaction? And then how should we navigate talking about the abuses that women can suffer? Avoid or amplify them? I'm just going to give you a few minutes to talk about that. Okay, so I'm just keeping track of time here, as I want to go over time. But thank you for engaging with those questions. We're going to zoom into a couple of stories, a couple of examples from the Bible about women. And the reason I'm doing this, if you go back for me, please. The reason I'm doing this is because I believe as a Christian that the Bible has this narrative arc, this bigger story that it's saying about God's intervention, nearly falling off the stage there, God's intervention into human history, okay? But actually, what I find compelling about the Christian faith is that this God isn't just doing this meta work. He's showing up in the day-to-day lives of individuals and individual women. So if we go to our next slide, just hold it for me on the image. This is a little sketch here of a story we read about in the book of Genesis, where God promises Abraham, one of the Bible patriarchs, you could say, that he's going to have a child. He's well past age, and so is his wife. And so the cultural tradition of the time was for a woman who was a bondservant or a slave in the household would sleep with and bear children for the man because the woman wasn't able to. A whole network of complicated feelings of fertility, infertility, belonging, enslavement. You could write essays upon all the dynamics that are happening in that household. And so Sarah, the woman who is Abraham's wife, is told, she gets upset and she says, you know what? This promise from God isn't going to happen. I think you should sleep with my maidservant. And then Abraham goes, well, I've got to take one for the team. So, I'll do it. Just because you said yeah. All right. And so he goes, and then Hagar gets pregnant. And then again, in this whole messy dynamic of feelings, all right, Sarah obviously feels upset and kind of her nose is out of joint about what's happened. And so she sends Hagar away. Hagar's heavily pregnant, all right, sends her out into the wilderness. And Hagar is not only an enslaved woman, but an Egyptian. So she's a woman of color that we see in Scripture. And many black women theologians really see Hagar and her story as a real focus point of the goodness of God. And so Hagar is sent out into the wilderness, as I said, pregnant. And this thing is not cooperating with me today. Ooh. And while she's there, she has an encounter with God. And it's what we call a theophany, where someone has like an encounter with God. And this is the first time that such an encounter is recorded in the Bible. And so if God exists, then he chose to show up to meet somebody the first time to an enslaved woman of color in Scripture. That is fascinating. And in that space, they have a conversation, and God encourages her. I'm going to take this off. God encourages her and gives her hope for her future. And then she says this about God. She says this. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Now these words are so powerful because Hagar is in a situation where she is deeply marginalized and disadvantaged and oppressed. But in that situation, God sees her. And this is why I want to really hit home for you, that the God of the Bible isn't one who does not see. A lot of the time, things happen to people, and although we know that someone else can't fix it, we want to be seen. We want to be believed. Can you believe me when I say this happened to me? And the God of the Bible, as Hagar says, he is the one who sees me. Another example, now from the New Testament, we have Mary, the mother of Jesus. And in this beautiful piece of poetry, which we call the Magnificat in St. Luke chapter 1, Mary is speaking. And I cannot hit home the significance of this piece of poetry we have. Because we have a text, a first century text, all right, the book of Luke, a biography of the life of Jesus. And so Luke is going around and getting eyewitness testimony about what he's seen Jesus doing. And one of the eyewitnesses is the mother of Jesus. And she recalls this song of praise, this poetry that she says when she's promised that she's going to give birth to Jesus. And she says this, my soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. Listen to how this is so similar. We're talking years after Hagar's experience in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. We're now in, the New Testament. She says something very similar. For he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant, the God who remembers, the God who sees, showing up in the life of a young woman, giving her a promise. And we get this whole text. There's a fantastic book by Dr. Amy Orr Ewing. It's called Mary's Voice, where she really just kind of goes deeply into why and how we have the testimony of a woman, a young woman from the first century, written in Scripture, how powerful that is and how kind of upending that is to what we know about how ancient texts were constructed and whose voices got amplified. The God who sees and the God who remembers. Again, this is significant because if we take a quote from Josephus Flavius from Antiquities, we understand how women's testimony worked in that culture. Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. That was the cultural context. And yet we have the testimony of Mary informing one of the biographies of Jesus, informing the eyewitness testimonies, accounts that we get. Her voice is being dignified. She's not just an extra in the play or in the scene, that God is creating. She's a pivotal voice. Is Christianity good news for women? I'm starting to think that maybe it is. So we've talked about the Old Testament, we've talked about the promise of Jesus to Mary, but then we're talking about the fact that Jesus' life is bookended, not only by what a lot of Christians believe, the virgin birth, this miracle, but also the resurrection. And you've got Justin Briley going to talk about this to you on Friday, this miracle that Jesus comes back to life. And I'll leave that to him to get in there with you. But in the account that we have in Luke, again, it is women who are on the scene. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They took the spices. They know that when someone dies, they stay dead. So they're going to prepare the body. They're not going there with the expectation the tomb would be empty. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told the disciples, listen to this. But They did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Obviously, if someone tells you, oh, do you know what, the tomb is empty and I think he's come back to life, you're not going to really take that too seriously. But we also need to be aware of the added dynamic that this testimony is coming from women. But the God of the Bible deigned it that the first reporters of the empty tomb would be women. Again, women's voices being amplified by the God of the Bible here. And it's really interesting that when we start to think about historically about the context in which this stuff is emerging, Rebecca McLaughlin makes some really helpful observations. She says this strange new first century faith, so remember Christianity is a burgeoning movement in the first century, this strange new first century faith flowing out of Judaism proved highly attractive to women. Sociologist Rodney Stark has shown from a wide array of textual and archaeological sources that the early church was majority women. It's still that case today. Interesting. This is particularly striking given that the Greco-Roman world in the 1st and 2nd centuries was disproportionately male due to selective infanticide of baby girls and the high proportion of maternal deaths in childbirth. Does this mean that Christianity is true? No. This whole week is about presenting a cumulative case for why we might take Christianity seriously in 2024. But this warrants investigation, that as Christianity was emerging as a movement, women were compelled by Jesus. And if you go to a church today, you'll see a lot of women in church. We are still compelled by Jesus. That warrants investigation. Why is that the case? She continues. Rebecca McLaughlin continues. If I can get my laptop to work. Indeed, early Christianity was mocked by outsiders for its appeal to women. The 2nd century Greek philosopher Celsus snarked that Christians want and are able to convince only the foolish. Who are the foolish? The dishonorable and the stupid. Who are they? Only slaves, women, and little children. While the 3rd century Christian apologists, I don't know how to say that, Felix recalls critics saying that Christianity attracted the dregs of the populace and credulous women with the inability natural to their sex. This is huge. The Christian faith and the dignity it gives to women is not only attracting them to the movement, but it's flying in the face of patriarchy, not just within the Jewish circles, but also within the Greco-Roman world at the time. Women take Jesus seriously. Why is that? When Child Q was asked, do you have drugs on you? She said no, she wasn't believed. And then this escalated horrible search happened. There are consequences to believing or not believing what women say. And there are many women, many Christian women in this room who are like, I'm convinced of who Jesus is. And it may well be that we need to give the time to investigate why. Why do you find Jesus compelling? I'm going to move on because we're running out of time here. I'm going to skip the next slide. We're going to go to, if you keep going for me. Yeah, just keep it there for me. Hold it. Oh, let's go back. Yeah. Anybody know who this is? Yes. Go for it.
He's very supported by that, right? He learned how to read and write.
He did.
Former slave abolitionist when I was at the North. Like, he was so intelligent that all these, like, people who were first slaves beforehand in New York and did the film sort of became convinced that black people were as intelligent as
Yeah. Thank you so much, friend. Thank you. My guy, Frederick Douglass, yeah? Love this guy, honestly. Anyway, so he was, as my friend said there, a significant abolitionist, right? And if you read his account, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, just be prepared to lie down. That's all I can say. It's a fantastic piece. And so he was a man who was not afraid to call out the institution of the transatlantic slave trade for what it was, and he was very condemnatory of it. And he says this: the man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin, the whip, during the week, fills the pulpit on Sunday. We're going to go down this road tomorrow, so don't worry. Is Christianity just a Western religion? He's saying, look, I'm getting whipped in the week, and the same person who's whipping me is jumping on stage to preach. There's an hypocrisy there. Claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on a Sunday to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. And this is really crucial. He says this is outlining the distinctive treatment or sufferings of women in that institution. He who sells my sister for the purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. Douglas doesn't play, yeah? So he's outlining the problems with the transatlantic slave trade and its entanglement with Christianity, and particularly the suffering of women. And there's loads of narrative accounts of women who suffered under the transatlantic slave trade. What's my point here? In a meeting with other abolitionists, Douglas got to the point where he was so frustrated and was like, this institution, it's not turning over. We're fighting a losing battle. And he was quite distressed and he'd kind of given up hope. And in this meeting, if we go to our next slide, somebody stood up. Let's keep going. Sojourner Truth. And she asked this question. She said, is God dead? That was her question. If you put it up on the screen for me, she asked, is God dead? Why did she ask that question? Because even as a formerly enslaved woman, who was still being treated badly, who had every reason to reject Christianity because of the way it was weaponized against her, she knew that the God of the Bible, the God that she had encountered, dignified her as a woman. And actually, getting rid of God at this point wasn't going to be the way to hope. It wasn't going to be the way to change. Actually, believing and trusting in God was going to be the way to hope and freedom. And we could say, oh, well, she was whipped into believing in Jesus. And she was coerced into believing in God. We could say that. But I think that is highly condescending. She is a critical thinker. When you read some of her speeches, this woman knows what she's talking about. And she's able to distinguish between the abuses of the faith and who she has encountered in God. Is Christianity good news for women? As a woman who has, as I said, every reason, all her children were taken away from her. Her story is just mind-blowing. She still trusted in God. She saw that there was something about the nature, the character of God that could be trusted despite every reason she had to reject God. Is Christianity good news for women? I'm deeply moved by Jesus, yeah? I take him seriously. I think he dignifies who I am as a woman. And that is the invitation that everyone in this room has this week, to explore the claims of the Christian faith, to bring your questions. God is not afraid of our big questions. And I can't say that I'll always have the answer, but this is the invitation that we have. I'm going to stop here. I'm 40 seconds over my time and just leave you with a couple of questions to think about as we move into the Q&A. Thank you so much.